Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Seoul. Unfortunately, it poured rain this morning, and so we can't really set up at the palace because there's no place under cover there where I can actually set up. So we are live from my Hanok, from my traditional Korean bed and breakfast here in Seoul. So we're actually sandwiched between the two palaces, between the two 15th century palaces. Actually, one of them was technically built in 1398, so late 14th century. And we're in this very traditional neighborhood that now, more than ever, is filled with these beautiful traditional style timber frame homes built in the Korean style. Good Sweden, my God, you got up early or stayed up late for this, Thomas. Wow, you are really dedicated. I appreciate that. We'll try again and do another one from the palace later on in the month or next month, and we'll hope that it doesn't pour rain. Apparently, a typhoon is on its way and is going to make landfall here on Tuesday, and it's supposed to be the biggest storm that's ever hit Korea in the entire history of people noticing weather phenomena. So that should be exciting. Um, yeah, so I guess I've received some interesting questions about various things I do medievally. So I'll start with addressing those. But if you have any questions as you're watching, please do feel free to pop them in the chat and I will address them. So, I'm here in Korea, and one of the questions I got is, well, what's living history like in Korea? Well, they're kind of in this in between place right now because Korea's kind of only relatively recently joined the world of affluent countries with a thriving middle class. And so they now do have the time and resources to engage in relatively silly hobbies like living history. And I say silly with all the affection in the world for something I've done for 27 years. Um, but they haven't necessarily decided that living history, the way most of us engage in it, is the kind of activity that is respectable. But there is a growing HEMA community here, historical European martial arts, mostly very young people, as you can imagine. For older people, it's still work, 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 work. Maybe take an occasional vacation to a respectable destination of historical importance, and then work, 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 and then retire, and then take care of your apartment or home. um, so but there is, that being said, there are living history interpreters here at the palaces. So they've got a whole basically regiment of Joseon era guards from early Joseon, actually from like the 15th, 16th century, who drill and put on demonstrations almost every day at Gyeongbokgung, and sometimes also at Doksugung. They do a changing of the guards. So and they're exploring their historical clothing, and a lot of Korean by a very skilled, very exclusive seamstress in Daegu. So this is not the typical thing that you'll see wandering the streets here in Korea, but people are taking an increasing interest in the Joseon era clothing anyway. So they're more interested in the 18th and 19th century styles because 15th and 16th century styles are just really baggy and frumpy looking, in my opinion. So they don't really meet with the modern idea of sexy and stylish, whereas sort of the late Joseon era styles do. So people are increasingly, they're not necessarily buying their own, although some people are, but what they do is when they come here to Seoul, they actually rent hanbo, not as nice as mine, but kind of in this style. And then they just walk around the palaces, experiencing the palaces sort of from a fairy tale historical perspective. So that is massively popular now amongst all ages. And so that is in itself, it is a form of living history. They're trying to live their cultural history by exploring historical sites in clothing that's closer to the history of the places. So I kind of see that maybe in the next 20 or 30 years, there might be a much bigger living history scene of where there are living history events and people maybe, have the full kits in the right style and they start doing the food in the style of the Joseon era, most likely Joseon. Down south, they might do Sheila, which is, an earlier medieval era. But this that I'm wearing, this is not. Don't interpret this as being any kind of medieval anything. It's not. Like I said, medieval Korean fashions very very not like this. The coats were big and long and kind of came down to the knees in some cases, or at least to the hips, and they were very, very voluminous and not very figure shaping at all, at all, at all. And the sleeves were really long and went past the hands, and it was basically more about hiding the body um, than accentuating the body. So yeah. So that's the state of living history here in Korea, and medieval living history specifically. We'll see what develops in the coming decades as Korea continues to hopefully grow its middle class and become more affluent, and maybe the culture shifts towards accepting that hobbies are socially acceptable things to have. Recently released that video on my pavilion. I had some very interesting questions I thought I would answer here in the chat as well, because they were some good ones. So some of you noticed that I have an actual straw mattress on which I camp, and this is for several reasons. One, a straw mattress means it takes up no room, because literally at the beginning of the event I buy a bale of straw at the event and I stuff my mattress ticking, which is just basically two sheets of fabric sewn together. And at the end, I dump the straw and fold up my ticking and take it home and wash it, and then it's ready to go for the next time. So it takes up no room in my vehicle, which is great. And it's also no weight, therefore, in my vehicle, which is also great. And then there is the question of comfort came up. Well, how comfortable is it? Well, I can tell you that straw mattresses are extremely comfortable. They're warm and or cool, depending. So they're, because it's all natural materials. Air mattresses. A lot of medieval people, when they do encampments, they might have an air mattress. And air mattresses, of course, even if they're not deflating, the air condenses in the night and they get cold, and then you get cold because the cold radiates up through your body if they're not properly insulated from you. It doesn't happen with a straw mattress. And so the other thing is that you can add as much straw as you want to make the mattress as big and fluffy as you want, or as thin and compact as you want. And basically every day I sort of fluff up. I actually have my lady in waiting go and fluff up the straw and redistribute it, because as I sleep in the night, the straw kind of moves around and actually forms a Contessa shaped groove in the mattress. And so we have to fluff it up and redistribute the straw every day. It could be that it's possible that actual medieval straw mattresses were actually sewn and channels were actually sewn down to keep the straw from doing that. But I have no evidence of that. I'm just thinking aloud in terms of that. But straw mattress is definitely an authentic mattress type. They're mentioned in many inventories, and usually in combination with other toppers. So with a wool mattress on top and or a feather mattress on top. And so my straw mattress is covered with a feather duvet and or a proper feather mattress topper, depending on where I am, because my Penzic setup is just sort of it's my travel setup. My full setup is in storage with it, where I actually do have a proper feather mattress topper that I put on top of the straw. The other question about the straw mattress was creepy crawlies. Do creepy crawlies, are they a problem? And I think specifically maybe coming from the straw. I've never had anything creepy or crawly come out of the straw and come over me in the night. If anything, the only creepy crawlies I've had fell down from the ceiling of the pavilion, which is prevented in my case by my silk canopy. Yeah, bushcraft. Yep, something like that in bushcraft, filling plastic waste bags with leaves and detritus. Yep, it's basically the same idea except on a bigger scale. In the case of my straw mattress, I don't actually, I didn't sew it shut this time at any rate. And it turns out that there was enough excess, and the fabric, the linen, I had linen canvas actually. The linen was stiff enough that when I rolled it up and sort of hand scrunched it using the heat of my hands, it stayed. It didn't come undone for the entirety of the 2-week event. Actually, okay, so I actually only had the straw mattress for 1 week because all of my mattress related items got left behind and had to be brought to me later on, as it turns out. Yeah. Anyway, so other questions about the straw mattress. Creepy crawlies, not a problem. both warm and cool and comfortable. I mean, it makes for a firmer mattress. If you're one of those people who needs a molded foam, silly, posturepedic, whatever, then yeah, you're going to definitely, the straw mattress is probably not for you. But then you're going to have to bring a mattress like that, and that's going to take up a lot of room in your car, and it's going to cost extra in fuel because you're carrying that extra weight and or creating extra drag by strapping the mattress to the top of your vehicle, as I've seen some people do. Yeah, then I also had a question about, oh, the butter. So in the video, I showed my table where I have all of my things laid out, and I have two little jars, and I have a jar with mustard in it for my beef sausages, and a jar with butter in it, and both of them are covered in wax linen. And the jar with butter, the question was, how do I keep it from melting? Well, so that one I can just put in my cold larder, which I keep snow fresh from the mountains. Because, I mean, if it doesn't get too hot, it's fine because it's salted butter. It doesn't go bad. It doesn't go rancid. The problem at an event like Pennsic, especially in my pavilion, is that it's in full sunshine for a good chunk of the day. And that full sunshine makes it warm inside because, unfortunately, that pavilion has been coated on the inside with some kind of plastic crap. I didn't know that when I bought it. And linen, so just so you all know, cotton canvas is naturally waterproof. If you just wet it, the first time you wet it, you would go over with a hose or let it sit out in the rain. After that, the fibers will swell when it dries, and it will basically be waterproof. You don't need to coat it in anything. So unfortunately, this one we bought sight unseen, and the manufacturers had decided it needed to be coated to make it waterproof. So that unfortunately means it doesn't breathe at all the way a good pavilion should breathe. A good cotton or linen canvas pavilion should breathe. And so when the sun hits my pavilion at Pennsic or any other given event, that particular pavilion, it's like a hot box. And so with butter, I forgot about the butter one day, and it literally clarified itself. It separated out into solids and fat. It was still edible. It just wasn't nearly as manageable because ghee is not, it's very liquidy. The butter didn't go bad because it was salted. But what I did thereafter was I would generally put it in my cold larder so that it wouldn't separate out into butter oil and butter protein solids. Yeah, so that was another good question that I thought. So, but that being said, I have no evidence of them being medieval, but there are pottery butter coolers, and it's actually two pieces. One piece slots into there's like a bowl, and you put water in the bottom of that bowl. And then the other piece slots into that, and it's got a wider rim, and it's got a narrower kind of pottery tube, and you put your butter into that, and then you put that into the bowl like this, upside down, because if the butter's cool enough, it's not going to sink. And it doesn't matter if the water goes all the way up to your butter, then the water will keep the butter from coming out. And that does evaporate, that then performs evaporative cooling, because unglazed clay will actually, the moisture will evaporate through it. And so that actually performs the active evaporative cooling, plus the water keeping things cooler anyway. So that was definitely an 18th century. It existed in the 18th century for certain. And so there are actually potters who will make, medieval potters who will make these butter coolers. And I do have several, and they keep breaking. So hard on my pottery. But that is a very good way of keeping your butter chilled, or just at least keeping it from separating into the fat and the proteins in even a medievalist situation. It might not have been a medieval. I've never seen an extant one from the Middle Ages, and I've never seen a picture of one, but it's a decent non-modern solution anyway. But in the case of, I just put mine in my cold larder with the fresh snow from the mountains. Let's see. Other questions people have put out to me. Oh, someone asked about bathing. Oh, well, I just lost my hair flower. Before we leave, my hair rose just came out and flew backwards. Yeah. By the way, if you have any questions about anything you see behind me or around me, let me know. I can rotate. At some point, I'll probably rotate the laptop so you can see the courtyard. These traditional Korean buildings are built in a style that really hasn't changed in centuries and centuries and centuries. In a lot of ways, medieval Korean culture is very conservative, and historical culture is very conservative, basically from sort of the 14th century onward, because it was all about Neo-Confucianism, which has a very strict set of rules and strictures, strict set of strictures, redundant anyway, about how things should be built. And they didn't deviate from that. So there wasn't very much in the way of stylistic innovation in Korean architecture for hundreds of years. And so traditional Korean homes that are built these days are still built around that idea of, a central courtyard. And I'll go ahead and turn, and this nice timber frame. And then over there, you can see there's a great room through those doors with nice high ceilings. And that platform there is actually a picnic platform, and that's for both sitting and eating. Get survivalist bushcraft tips as a bonus. Well, the reality is that medievalism, there's a lot of survivalism involved. It's, it's a pre-industrial, pre-modern world. So while they were very innovative, their solutions were, much, much lower tech, obviously, than what we have today, which means that, in the coming apocalypse, true medievalists might actually not do too badly. We'll see. Hopefully, maybe we'll not see. We'll see how the world develops. Anyway, so I talked in my video about the pavilion about bathing, and how I actually basically took a little basin bath every night before going to bed, because the dust from the roads was pretty awful everywhere. And actually, it's one of the aspects of a 2-week event like Pennsic that is unfortunately authentic. Because, in most medieval cities, most roads weren't paved. And so it got dusty when it was dry, and it got muddy when it was wet. And dusty when it's dry, and skirts dragging on the ground means that you end up with lots of dust just coating your legs. Any part of your legs that are not covered by stocking, it's pretty awful. And even through the stockings, the dust gets through the stockings 100%. Not as much, but still it's there. And especially along my shoes, where my hem sort of forces the dirt into the stockings. And so I would, scrub before going to bed every night, because otherwise I felt like a nasty human being. But what I didn't do the entire 2 weeks, not even once, I didn't wash my hair with soap and water. But my comb, the fact that A, I kept my hair covered for most of the time, and B, my medieval comb actually kept my hair super duper clean, and there wasn't a problem with oil or anything like that, because I wasn't constantly using soap to strip the oil out of my scalp and hair. And because of that, my scalp doesn't produce lots and lots of oil to compensate for that. And so, you can see my hair still looks nice. So this whole idea that you need to wash your hair every day or once a week or whatever is not with soap, with a surfactant, specifically, is just not true. In fact, occasionally I would just put a little bit of olive oil in my hair and then comb it through, and that would be all she wrote. And that really removed everything. You could see what I was removing because it's on the comb. It's kind of nasty. You could see the sort of detritus and oils that were coming out. So another tip, you don't need to wash your hair. In fact, people who wash their hair with Pennsic water rue it. They rue it because the water there is super mineral laden and lots of iron, lots and lots of iron. And iron is not good for human hair. It's really destructive, and it dries it out and it makes it break. So it's actually better at places like that to not use the water on your hair if you can avoid it. So let's see. Other questions that came about my pavilion and or my medievalist lifestyle. Oh, patents. So people noticed in the video I talk about my overshoes. So I have 2 different kinds. I've got my 15th century Italian style, the Pianella, really nice, really refined leather platform shoes, basically. And then I have my Burgundian patents. And the Burgundian patents were much simpler and made of wood with just leather strapping. And both of those are essential if you're wearing medieval footwear outside, because medieval footwear is made of just leather, and it's turned leather, and it doesn't have there's no hammered sole, there's no extra sole. Even though I have found in several inventories from the 15th century mention of leather of shoes with double soles, interestingly. So that might have been a solution for people who couldn't afford pattens or who didn't want to wear pattens, was just to have a second sole added onto the first sole. So the pianella, those are the tall leather overshoes that I was wearing. Those are great on flat surfaces. They are not great going up and down hills. They are definitely not great on uneven surfaces because they're designed for city wear. And so I did wear them around Penzic, and I did walk up and down hills with them, but it certainly isn't the most happy thing I've ever done to my feet. That being said, those things kept me out of the muck, especially on days when it was raining. They really did a good job of keeping my hems up and out of the mud and keeping my shoes from getting sort of a baptism of mud. The wooden pattens are much more agile. They allow me to do a lot more things like climbing up and down hills, no problem. Running, no problem. Dancing, no problem. All kinds of surfaces, no problem, because they were lower and they're also hinged right under the ball of my foot. Yeah. So for those just joining, if you have questions, please pop them, or comments, please pop them in the chat and I will address them. Otherwise, I'm just going to continue to hold forward. Let's see, other questions that cropped up. Oh, my oil lamp. So in my pavilion, I had an oil lamp that I didn't get to use this time, but I have used that kind of oil lamp a lot. And there were questions about fire safety and that sort of thing. And I mean, as with anytime you have an open flame, you want to make certain that you have something nearby that you can possibly douse it. So there's always a fire extinguisher at hand. And that's extremely modern, but personally, medieval firestorms are not an aspect of medieval culture and life that I would like to relive. So yeah, always keep a fire extinguisher nearby. But that being said, I've never, knocking on wood, set my pavilion on fire. Other people have. But I haven't. In fact, one time I was walking home at a Penzic several years ago and walking back up from the lake down one of the roads. And I noticed that someone had a fire, a big fire actually, and the fire had just kind of exploded past its fire pit and was just burning in the grass on the side of the road and was sort of making its way slowly towards someone's pavilion. I'm assuming the person who set the fire. They weren't there. And so I went to security and reported it. And it was the damnedest thing because I couldn't seem to get anyone excited about this fire that was no longer in a fireplace or inside a fire stone of circles. And that was just spreading down the road. It was really remarkable. I think eventually they sent someone and doused it. But as for my oil lamp, the thing about oil lamps, you want to make sure that you have plenty of wick. And it's a cotton wick. It's just basically cotton, like pure cotton rope. And you want to make sure that there's plenty poking up past the oil, because what you don't want to have happen is for the flame to burn down into the oil and set the oil on fire. So you always want to make sure that your wick is sufficiently high above the spout. And the interesting thing about how these wicks work is that they kind of will pull themselves up and out of the oil as it burns, as long as you have enough distance between the flame and the wick that's coiled around in the oil. And of course, the wick wicks the oil up into the flame. And then from there, it just kind of keeps feeding up the rope. And so the wick is not really burning that much. What's burning is the oil as it kind of gets pulled to the tip of the wick. So that's how you prevent your oil lamp from catching on fire. That being said, there are many different kinds of lamps and lanterns from this period. So an oil lamp like the kind I had with the open is not the only option. But those things burn really bright, especially if you use olive oil, which I always do because I'm a Contessa and I can afford to burn expensive things like olive oil. So lighting, that pavilion, unfortunately, as I said, my Penzig pavilion is my travel pavilion. It's not my full kit. My full kit, I actually have wooden chandeliers across two pieces of wood like this, basically, with little spots for candles that suspends from the spokes of my hub and spoke pavilion. I don't have those at Penzig, unfortunately, but I do have those in my regular kit, and they produce a lot of light. And you see those in actually Roi René's Book of the Tournament, King René's Book of the Tournament. You actually see those suspended from the ceiling. So they're actually, it's a very authentic, portable method of chandelier for a pavilion. It's possible actually that the Duke of Burgundy brought real brass chandeliers with him when he was on campaign, but those all got looted when he died, when his encampment was literally overrun by Swiss mercenaries in 1477. So we kind of don't know all of what was there and what was lost because it all ended up in churches in Switzerland for the most part. Medieval glamping when you lose. No, God, no, Jesus, no earwax candles for the Contessa, and definitely no rush lights made from beef tallow. Does not smell good when it burns at all. Ugh. I mean, you would think it would because it's meat, it's meat fat. It should smell good if you burn it, but it really doesn't smell great. Yeah, beeswax, and olive oil for me. Thank you very much. I love the smell of beeswax. It's so sweet. And actually at events, large events like Penzig, there's a lot of things you don't need to bring because you can supply yourself there. So at Penzig in particular, there's a bee people. They're called the bee people, and they have all kinds of honey harvested from all kinds of amazing flowers, and they have tons of wax candles in all shapes and sizes. And so I just buy my lighting supply there when I'm there. Olive oil I have to buy offsite and bring in, which I do. And I even have a nice olive oil cruet, which I didn't have this year, but I will have next year. Yeah, monastery earwax candles. That sounds horrifying on so many levels. The harvesting of it alone sounds horrifying, honestly. Let's see. So I actually had a bad dream last night about a medieval event I was running. I dreamt that we held this event at a convention center, basically, and we weren't allowed to cook. So they did the cooking for us. And not only was the food terrible, but there wasn't enough of it. So half of the people didn't get to eat anything. And it was all my fault because I was a bad event steward. Yes, those are the kind of nightmares I have. Also, I have nightmares about missing my classes at events when I've agreed to teach a class and just forgetting that I was teaching a class and not showing up. That's actually a recurring nightmare I also have. Let's see. At medievalist events, I tend to teach a lot, as I guess I just indicated. A lot of dance. Sometimes I teach at events. I'll actually teach classes on finger loop braiding as well. And it's funny. I teach hand sewing professionally and embroidery professionally, but I don't tend to teach that very often at medievalist events. I focus more on dance because honestly, I think there are lots of people who do handwork in various medievalist organizations. There aren't lots of people who actually research, reconstruct, and teach medieval and Renaissance dance. So I don't think that I know that from experience. So I tend to mostly end up teaching lots and lots of dance at events. And I really do focus hard on dances that are documentably within the period in question and trying to be as faithful as possible to manuscripts that are hundreds of years old and that are using words to describe motion. And as you probably know, using words to describe motion is really tricky and can lead to multiple interpretations of a particular action. Have you ever thought about how to describe taking a step using words, for instance? It's not as easy as you think it is. And then what kind of step and how that step should look and all of that. So for those just joining, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I've been actually addressing questions that I received in advance. Today, for those just joining us, I'm actually sorry I couldn't set up at the palace because it was pouring rain this morning and there's no covered place for me to set up at any of the palaces, because they don't let you into the rooms. At least not now. They used to in the before times, before COVID. But unfortunately, these days in the medieval royal palaces in Seoul, they're not letting people inside yet, even though inside isn't terribly inside because all the doors are up and the windows are up, and so there's this cross breeze. But hopefully in the next couple of months they might open things back up again, so you can actually go into the pavilions and the rooms and actually experience them at a much more foot on, hands on level. But so for now we're at my traditional Korean Hanok or B&B, bread and breakfast, and I'll just do another turnaround to see. You can see the beautiful woodwork and this wooden screen. Sorry, my laptop's not on a nice flat surface, so it's harder to do this. And there's this beautiful courtyard with all these beautiful plants. And interesting thing about, let's see if we can stabilize this again. Interesting thing about medieval Korean architecture, because even though this is new, it was built very recently, it's built in a medieval style, using the same medieval techniques that they used for centuries upon centuries. Interesting thing I read about this traditional medieval style Korean architecture is that it was an article by a German architect, and he said this should be the model that we're using for sustainable living spaces going forward, sustainable architecture, because it's 100% biodegradable. It's basically, mud and plaster and wood and paper and clay tiles, and they're designed specifically to deal with all the elements, because Korea is a hard 4-season place. Summers are super hot and humid, winters are super dry and cold. And so these buildings were actually built to leverage those conditions. And so the eaves, look at these eaves, see if you've got these big eaves overhanging these places where you can sit. So those eaves are designed in the summer to stop the sun from getting into the interior spaces. And then in the winter, because the angle of the sun is lower because of this latitude, the sunlight can get in and then warm the spaces. So in the summer, those eaves keep it cooler by shading it. And in the winter, they keep it warmer by letting the sun in. And then in a traditional style, Hanok, which these ones they were built to be bed and breakfast, to be a hotel, so they've got solid walls everywhere. But in the traditional ones, all of those doors and windows actually open completely up and can be suspended. And so you get this complete cross breeze. And all of the walls inside are modular. And so you can either open all the walls up or close them all up. So in the summer, you can open everything up, and it creates this great cross breeze, and it's really cool inside, no matter how hot, humid it is outside. And the style of ceiling that they have creates a circulating effect so that the hot air rises to the top and the cool air sinks to the bottom. And then in the winter, you can close all the rooms up and create little compartments that are easier to keep warm, and that prevents breeze from cooling everything. So, this medieval style of architecture should actually be the thing on which homes are modeled going forward to be sustainable, both in terms of energy consumption and construction and impact on the environment. So, yeah. I thought that was a really interesting thing about medieval Korean architecture. And of course, actually, medieval European architecture has similar features with different materials. In Italy, those stone buildings, they basically stay a constant temperature all year round. So you have, and it's kind of always 70-something degrees or 20-something degrees centigrade if you monitor temperatures that way. So, there's a lot we can learn from medieval technology. We think we've advanced so much, but in many ways we've regressed, I would actually say. Yeah. So are there any questions from anyone? I say we've got 3 viewers at the moment. So yeah, if you have questions, please do plop into the chat and let me know. For those just joining you, what I'm wearing is not medieval Korean attire at all. This is very modern. At sort of the 18th century is when stand up and maybe show you. The 18th century is when the chogori, this is the jacket, got short and the bodice got long and fitted and tight. But before that, the the Korean clothing was sort of for women was very, very voluminous and it sort of hid the figure rather than being very feminine and fitted. Yeah. So I prefer feminine and fitted, which is why I'm not a big fan of 14th and 15th century, 16th century, 17th century Korean fashions. Actually, if I were going to do Korean medieval clothing, it would be Shilla era. So first millennium, sort of 5th through 10th centuries. They actually followed the fashions of the Tang dynasty in China. And so they've got these really beautiful fitted coats and beautiful full skirts and different colored silks and all the layers and the full sleeves that, kind of taper out, sort of like Leo sleeves, actually. And beautiful belts to kind of accentuate the waist. Yeah, if I were going to do medieval clothing from Korea, it would definitely be first millennium clothing. Whereas I wouldn't do first millennium clothing from Europe for anything in the world unless it's ancient Roman 1st century. That's my style. I prefer fitted and lots of beautiful layers of elegant fabrics. Okay, well, I think I've actually gone through all of the questions I had. Or that people sent me in advance that I was going to answer, just pondering through the comment sections of my, let me go take a peek here. Let's see. Let's see. Yeah, how do I keep the butter from spoiling? Oh, in the video I did, on several of the videos I've done recently, I'm wearing this beautiful 15th century collar, Burgundian collar specifically. And someone asked if I made it. No, I am not a jeweler. I have many skills. I am not even a little bit a jeweler. That was made, that beautiful collar, the Maria Portinari collar, that was made by Armor and Castings from the Ukraine. So they make amazing, amazing pieces from a variety of eras. And they're very much, they base it either on extant pieces or on pieces from portraits. And they're very knowledgeable. Their communication skills are excellent. So I can highly recommend products from Armor and Castings. They do belt buckles, they do necklaces, they do jewelry, all sorts of items. Yeah. Oh, Thomas says, I was at a Tudor dance evening in South Leeds or South, where's SL? Earlier, but dressed for the court in Ferrara. So I know about being wrong dressed for the occasion. But interesting you should say that. So we do know from the chronicles of the era that that Second Life. Oh, Second Life. All right. Okay. That people from, there was a lot of travel happening in medieval Europe. There's this weird myth and misconception that medieval people never left their villages, but it's not true. Even commoners went on pilgrimages to towns that were very far away and where the culture might have seemed completely different. And in some cases went on pilgrimages very far away, as in Compostela or Rome, or even in some really odd cases, Jerusalem. So there was a lot of cross-cultural exchange. And we know that in the chronicles, for instance, I have a chronicle from a dance in Ferrara, where the chronicle talks about ladies dressed in the French fashions, which is actually probably Burgundian, but dressed in the French fashions and dressed in the English fashions and the Hungarian fashions, and gentlemen dressed in Sienese styles. And so, there was a presence of different fashions in of the same era, obviously, but different fashions in different places, and they were dancing the Italian dances, but they were wearing their garments from very far away indeed. And we know that in Bruges there were many Medici bankers from Florence, for instance, not just Medici bankers, but Medici bankers also. And they would go dressed in their Florentine fashions, and they would go dance at the court of the Duke. So yeah, that is actually a thing that happened. Now, granted, someone wearing clothing from 1450 to a ball in 1520, not so much. Although someone wearing clothing that they had made in 1450 to a ball that happened in 1470, that happened for certain. That is also mentioned, that certain people were dressed in, in old-fashioned attire. Yeah. But I will say that, a lot of people ask me why I don't do English country dance at medievalist events. Well, English country dance is from the 17th century. We have no evidence of actual English country dances being done before 1600. Um, there's some mention, someone I've heard apocryphally some mention that Elizabeth liked country dances, and I've never found that actual quote. So I have no idea whether that's true or not, but we have no evidence of it. There's no choreographies. It's not mentioned in any of the dance manuscripts from before the 17th century. And if I'm wearing my 15th century clothing of any, whether it's Italian, it's Florentine, Venetian, Milanese, Burgundian, French, English, German, doesn't matter. Any of my 15th century fashions feel so awkward dancing 17th century dance. Very, very, very awkward, because 17th century dance was a response to 17th century fashion. And so those dances are designed to move in the kind of clothing those people wore. And that kind of clothing is not even vaguely related in cut and drape in style to clothing of the 15th century, of any part of the 15th century. And so those dances just feel completely awkward to me. And that's why I don't enjoy doing 17th century dance at medievalist events. It's not some kind of weird snobbery. I actually do enjoy English country dance if I'm wearing 17th century or 18th century or even 19th century clothing, early 19th century clothing. Don't enjoy it if I'm wearing clothing from before that era, because it doesn't move correctly in the least, and it feels just awkward to me. Yeah, so yeah, so actually, for those who are just joining, I'm sorry, but we're kind of at like minute 41. And I think I've basically covered everything, except for maybe why I do this medieval living history thing, and why I have devoted tens of thousands of hours into achieving mastery in some really esoteric skills. And I guess that's because there is a beauty and an elegance of various cultures of the Middle Ages that really appeals to me. Certainly the courtly romance side. I mean, I grew up reading the Arthurian legends, and those were very influential in forming my idea of what polite society should be. But even the more I've dug, the more I've explored past that romantic image, it's fascinated me and engages me, and it feels right. Now, granted, there are lots of downsides to medieval life. I have no desire to actually go and live a medieval life unless I can have all the medical technology from the modern world. um, but there are there are very, very many aspects of the culture and the crafts that just sing to me in a certain way. And I was reading a paper about nostalgia and how historical reenactment is actually an expression of vicarious nostalgia, because it's not an era we experience directly, because, I'm not 700 years old, but we still feel this nostalgia for this era about which we've read, that we've seen in illuminations. And so we yearn to experience at least the beautiful side of that. And so for me, medieval living history is mostly about experiencing the beautiful side of that life. But occasionally I do enjoy experiencing the downsides as well, especially if it's accidentally so, where, for instance, I'm cooking on my medieval hearth, and I've got my medieval pots. And the first time I ever did this, I took the pot off of the fire safely using mitts. I didn't grab the pot with my hands, but I put it on the cold ground. And can any of you guess what happened to the pot when I put the super hot pot on the cold Sweden? I was in Sweden, actually. And I put the pot on cold Swedish soil. It exploded. It shattered. And so the yummy, I'd been cooking frumenti inside of it. And so the frumenti which is a kind of porridge of barley, it was ruined. It had shards of pottery in it, because I didn't think about the thermal shock, because thermal shock is not something that you really have to care about so much with modern metal pans. It's not, you might warp your pan a little bit, but the pan's not going to explode. And so my clay pot exploded. It did, rightly. But I learned from then on out to have a board next to my hearth, and I would put the pot on the board instead of on the cold ground. And I never had a pot explode ever again. And so, yes, that's a downside. of medieval life, but it was enjoyable, and it actually was one of those transformative moments. It's like, oh wow, this feels like someone at some point learned this the hard way before I did, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of years ago, since we've been cooking in clay pots for a very long time. And living historians like us, we're experimenting in a lot of ways and recreating the wheel, whereas our medieval forebears had the knowledge that they inherited from their parents. And we've lost that set of knowledge in exchange of a new set of knowledge, although I think in many cases in the modern world, we haven't inherited as much as we used to inherit from our parents in terms of useful life skills, sadly. But soapbox off. So yeah, vicarious nostalgia is psychologists are attributing our desire to relive these past eras to vicarious nostalgia, and maybe they're not wrong. You know, we're not interested in recreating the infectious disease side of the Middle Ages, but we are interested in recreating the beautiful, the creative, the social aspects, I think, is what I really love. You know, when I'm at a medievalist event, I don't feel the need to be on social media at all, because I have all my friends and companions with me, and I don't need to communicate with people in a virtual method or interact with people in a virtual method, because we're all right there and we're interacting and we're singing and we're dancing and we're telling stories and we're reading. I have my ladies in waiting reading to me, and we're dining together and we're laughing and we're exchanging witty repartee. So, those are definite real aspects of medieval life that I think are probably some of my favorite ones to recreate. Oh, and deeds of arms. I do like deeds of arms when the men and women at arms are accoutered appropriately with nice armor and nice surcoats, and they're engaged in sort of a deadly dance of deeds. I do enjoy that aspect as well. Yeah, vicarious nostalgia is it was a very interesting paper that I was reading, and it was kind of shocking. I haven't read anything about it before, since it really specifically talks about living history. And it specifically said that it's the US and Europe where living history is, of course, has taken off the most. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's the parts of the world that have sort of gotten the furthest along the technological chain that are now kind of yearning for a slower pace of life that definitely existed before. Life was certainly slower before clocks. And that sort of want more hands-on interactive experiences. I saw a picture of an Italian city replica in a space habitat. What an idea. Yeah, that would be pretty interesting. Although I eventually want to take a walk, and that could be problematic in space. But yeah, my Lord husband and I sometimes fantasize about buying one of these medieval Italian villages that are just up for sale. By the way, everyone, if you don't know, you can buy a medieval Italian village in the middle of nowhere, mind you, with no public transport going to or from it. But you can buy an entire medieval village for almost no money. And actually, resorts, like Hilton chain hotels like Hilton and Marriott, are now buying properties like that and turning them into really nice resorts where they have to keep the original medieval architecture. They're not allowed to level it, but they're allowed to renovate it and make it livable again. And so you can actually go and stay in these medieval villages by going to a Hilton resort. How crazy is that? But yeah, the idea is to buy one of these medieval villages, maybe with a collection of fellow medievalists, and turning it into maybe either the place we live or an actual medieval resort. Again, focusing on the beautiful side and not so much all the many downsides of medieval life. And I kind of fantasize about that sometimes, but on the other hand, I like traveling and I like leaving my home. And those kind of hospitality situations, unless you can get very successful very quickly and actually afford to hire people to be there in your stead, you're kind of tied to it. So I don't know. We're playing with the idea. He's my Lord husband is in the US Army, and he's coming up on retirement. And so we're kind of looking at what the shape of his post-military career is going to be. That's an option we're kind of fathoming. My great-grandparents were Italian, and I possibly might be able to actually get Italian citizenship. So, it could be a thing. You know. On the other hand, I like other periods of history too. It's very challenging. I might have to have a different house for each period of history and culture. I will keep you in mind, Thomas. If we go this route, I will put the word out and see what who might actually be interested. I mean, honestly, it's an idea. What year is it? I've been toying with this idea for almost 20 years. It started with the German castles, the East German castles that were selling on eBay for really super duper cheap, but you had to agree to restore it. And then, I kind of migrated down south. Like, Italy's really pretty. I like being in Italy. I've spent lots of time in Italy also. Italy's nice. It's got its pluses and its minuses. Okay, well, I've kind of held forth for about 50 minutes now. Are there any questions from anyone in the gallery about medievalism, my journey through medievalism, specific things I do, specific things you might be interested in, wonder if I have a clue about? My gorgeous traditional Korean paper cup. Oh, I'm sorry if the sound of my swallowing is coming through my lapel mic. I apologize. That is probably not a pleasant sound for anyone. Okay, well, there's a bit of a lag, so I'm just going to give it a moment to see if there's any further questions. Otherwise, I don't sign off yet. Oh wait, let me see. Yes, keep browbeating your brother to buy not just a house, a villa, damn it, or a palazzo. There are some of the smaller cities in city states of Italy, of medieval Italy. Actually, there are some whole palazzi for sale. I'm thinking of there's a Pistoia outside of Florence, and Lucca might actually have some palazzi for sale. Lucca, the city of church towers. There might even be some in Pisa, actually. Pisa, although it's got the leaning tower, is not as it doesn't have as much cachet and is therefore not as overpriced as a place like Florence is. Yeah, buy a palazzo. We want a palazzo. I want a palazzo. Which, by the way, in medieval Italian homes, the kitchens were on the top floor, for those of you who don't know that. And this is very sensible if you think about it, because if the kitchen catches on fire, then maybe just the top floor burns and not the whole thing. It's not particularly great, maybe from a logistical perspective of getting your supplies up to the kitchen for cooking and maybe bringing the food back down the stairs for service, but it makes sense from a fire safety perspective. Yeah. Okay, otherwise, see if there's any last comments, and I will just go ahead and make some closing remarks just in case. Thank you all for joining me today. It's been lovely. It's an overcast, rainy day here in Seoul and relatively cool, although humid. So I'm sorry, I did promise that this would be at a medieval Korean palace. Unfortunately, it's raining and has been raining, and there are no places sufficiently covered for me to set up at Gyeongbokgung, because you're not allowed into the palace, into the pavilions currently. In the before times you were, but since the pandemic, they've stopped allowing people to actually go into the various pavilions and explore them or sit in them. So hopefully on the next one I schedule for being inside a medieval Korean palace, we'll actually be inside a medieval Korean palace, because it hopefully won't be raining. It wasn't supposed to rain, but it rained. There it is. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much. If you have any other questions or comments, no, non è mio, Signore Tommaso. If you have any further questions or comments, once this publishes, please feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll address them in another Q&A. Otherwise, I appreciate you all supporting my Q&A this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. And I wish you all a lovely rest of your day, whatever it may be. Ciao! 안녕히 가세요, as they say here in Korea. Oh, Junfil, you were there. Ha!